Good afternoon, everyone. Nice to be here. Nice to virtually meet you all, even if I don't get to actually meet you all in person today. I guess so. I'm talking about the business behaviour, and I guess my, if you like, my contention or one of the things to my hypothesis, if you like, is that if you're in business, then you are in the business of behaviour, and if you don't have an understanding of actually what drives human behaviour and the fundamentals of human behaviour and what impacts on human behaviour, then actually business success will always be limited, whether that's in terms of financial well-being and employee engagement, or that's externally. Obviously, if you don't get people to buy your goods and services as a business, then your business will fail, and that's a behaviour that you need to drive. And I guess so today what I'm going to talk through is a bit of some of the fundamentals around what we now know about human behaviour and what influences human behaviour, because we've learned more about what influences human behaviour over the last 50 years than we have in the previous 5,000. So there's lots of new scientific discovery that's happened around that. And then also about, I guess, when we're talking about financial decision-making in particular, what some of those key influences are and how you can apply those within your organisation. So in terms of who I am and my background, so I've been working in communication strategy and behavioural science and training for over 15 years now. I worked initially for government here in the UK. Those of you who remember some of those scary anti-smoking ads in the mid-noughties with people with hooks in their mouths and stuff like that, that was me, so sorry if I gave any of you nightmares. And then I went on to Australia, where I was Communication Strategy Director for Australian Federal Government across everything that government communicates about there. So everything from getting people to sign up for the armed forces to financial decision-making around pensions and saving for the future, to issues like climate change and public health issues like smoking and obesity. And then when I returned, I'm also a board member of the Association for Business Psychology. So I guess if you like, I'm the kind of token behavioural economist, behavioural scientist on the board there. The Association for Business Psychology, those of you who aren't familiar with it, is the home and voice of business psychology in the UK, with a membership of over 1,000 people, most of whom have come from an occupational or IO psychology background. And when I returned from Australia, I led a behavioural practice called Ogilvy Change, which is a behavioural science consultancy now called Ogilvy Consulting. And I work with a range of commercial clients, you can see there. I now run my own business called Communication Science Group, which is a specialist agency that specialises in applied behavioural science in communication. So effectively, how you can use communications more effectively to actually change people's behaviour. And I have a book coming out called The Business of Behaviour, hence the title today, a bit later this year. So that's a bit of background on me, I guess. But the first thing I want to do, as I often do in these situations, is to ask you all a simple question. This is a question that some of you may be familiar with. It's quite well known now. It's been asked of thousands of people all around the world. And it was created by Daniel Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize for Economics in 2002. And the question is simply this. A bat and a ball costs $1.10 in total. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? Simple question. And those of you who hadn't seen the question before, answer's 10 cents, right? Yeah? 10 cents? Most of you thinking 10 cents? Put your hand up if your instinctive answer to this question is 10 cents. Yeah, it's probably about half the room. Because the correct answer is actually 5 cents. But about 80% of people, when they're asked this question, say 10 cents. And that's our instinctive answer to that question. Does everyone see why it's 5 cents? Because if the ball was 10 cents, the bat would cost $1.10, so the combined total would be $1.20. The interesting thing about this question is, if you're good at maths, so you've got a maths degree, for example, you're more likely to get it wrong. Because you trust your instincts, and you trust that the answer is 10 cents. You go, oh, it's so easy, it's 10 cents. But actually it's wrong, and it's an example of what we call a heuristic, which is a mental rule of thumb, or a behavioural bias, which in this particular case leads us to make a mistake in judgment. And that's why, as I say, about 80% of people get this question wrong. And the interesting thing about this is if you think about it in terms of how we make decisions and how humans make decisions, and the new world in which we're living in now, where we're increasingly delegating decision-making to machines, machine learning, algorithms, and so on, is a machine would never get this wrong. It's a really simple question. And in fact, when I saw Daniel Kahneman speak in New York a couple of years ago, he came up with this great quote, which was, if you feed the same data with an algorithm twice, you'll get the same answer. This is not true of people. And that's really the fundamentals of this, is that people are irrational. We do have these heuristics and biases that guide our decision-making, and that can lead us to make errors, lead us to behave in irrational ways. And that's not true of robots. and humans are not robots. And the reason we know this is because we have these two systems of thinking, and this is the kind of fundamentals of behavioral economics that Daniel Kahneman codified, which is we have what was called automatic or system one thinking, which is a very fast, instinctive, uncontrolled, effortless, emotional decision-making system, which controls actions like speaking in our mother tongue, speaking in our first language. We don't really have to consciously think about that. Taking a daily commute. If you've been working in the same place for some time, your journey to work is done on instinct, it's done on habits. You don't really have to consciously think about it. And similarly, when you were out there and you saw the cakes out in the break, you might have just gone, "Oh, I fancy some cake," and picked it up without really consciously thinking about what you were doing. And that's why Homer Simpson is kind of the poster boy for System 1 thinking. As in the book Nudge, which we'll talk about in a moment, they categorize System 1 thinking as being very much like Homer Simpson. Homer acts on impulse. It's largely driven by his desire for beer and donuts. He doesn't think before he acts. And that's what categorizes System 1 thinking. System 2, categorized by Spock from Star Trek, who is totally rational, every decision he makes, is what's known as reflective thinking, which is much more controlled, effortful, deductive, slow, and self-aware. So, for example, speaking a second language, you have to consciously think about the words that you're using. Planning unfamiliar journeys. So your journey here today, if this isn't somewhere you've been before or you're not familiar with, you probably have to consciously think about it. And if you're being careful about what you're eating, you're counting your calories. That's much more System 2. And the important thing about this, in terms of thinking about how we make decisions and how we behave, is that traditionally, we tend to talk to people or assume people are in that reflective mode, particularly when it comes to financial decision-making. Because financial decisions are important, and they're based on numbers. But what we know is that actually about 90% of our decision-making in pretty much every category is of the System 1 type, is the Homer type. And so when you're thinking about your employees, when you're thinking about your stakeholders, a lot of the time they're in that System 1 mode. And that's how we should think about them in terms of influencing their behavior. And the reason we know this as well, the good analogy for it rather, is that it's like an elephant with a rider. So if you think of your System 1 brain as the elephant, and System 2 thinking as being like the rider, the guy who's riding the elephant thinks he's in control of the elephant. But if the elephant's going in a particular direction, it's going in that direction. There's not much we can do about it. And that's because it's the dominant system in our brain. So it's a cross-section of human brain where most of our decision-making happens when we're in the System 1 mode is in the red and pink and yellow parts of the brain. And that's the oldest part of our brain. That's the part we share with other animals. If you looked at a monkey's brain, for example, it would be very similar in terms of those red and yellow pink parts. The bit that's evolved more in humans is the white part, the cerebrum. And that's evolved more recently. But as you can see, it sits over the top of the brain, over the top of what's called the lizard brain. And that is the bit where most of the System 2 decision-making happens. And it's trying to control those red and pink and yellow parts, but those are the bits that are directly connected to our brainstem. So when we're in that instinctive System 1 mode, we'll do stuff on instinct because it's directly connected to our movements of our limbs. Does that make sense? The other reason we know this is because when you look at, for example, the behavior of some of our nearest animal ancestors, particularly things like monkeys, in this video we're going to see some capuchin monkeys who are some of the most evolved apes. They have a lot of these same heuristics and biases that we have. So one of our heuristics that really guides our decision-making is our desire for fairness. Someone gets a pay rise next to us, then we wonder why we're not getting pay rise too. Why do they deserve it more than we do? And that's a very emotional System 1 response. And so in this particular video, you'll see how with monkeys, they're very driven by a strong sense of fairness as well. So it's part of our evolutionary makeup. So the thing to know before I show you this video is that monkeys really like grapes. Grapes are their favorite thing to eat, okay? Cucumber, they will eat, but they're not so bothered about because it's basically water, okay? So you'll see what happens.
So a final experiment that I want to mention to you is our fairness study. And so this became a very famous study, and there's now many more, because after we did this about 10 years ago, it became very well known. And we did that originally with capuchin monkeys, and I'm going to show you the first experiment that we did. It has now been done with dogs, and with birds, and with chimpanzees. But with Sarah Brosnan, we started out with capuchin monkeys. So what we did is we put two capuchin monkeys side by side. Again, these animals, they live in a group. They know each other. We take them out of the group, put them in a test chamber. And there's a very simple task that they need to do. And if you give both of them cucumber for the task, the two monkeys side by side, they're perfectly willing to do this 25 times in a row. So cucumber, even though it's really only water in my opinion, but cucumber is perfectly fine for them. Now if you give the partner grapes, the food preferences of my capuchin monkeys correspond exactly with the prices in the supermarket. And so if you give them grapes, it's a far better food, then you create inequity between them. So that's the experiment we did. Recently, we videotaped it with new monkeys who had never done the task, thinking that maybe they would have a stronger reaction, and that turned out to be right. The one on the left is the monkey who gets cucumber. The one on the right is the one who gets grapes. The one who gets cucumber, note that the first piece of cucumber is perfectly fine. The first piece she eats. Then she sees the other one getting grape, and you will see what happens. So she gives a rock to us, that's the task. And we give her a piece of cucumber, and she eats it. The other one needs to give a rock to us. And that's what she does. And she gets a grape. And she eats it. The other one sees that. She gives a rock to us now, gets again cucumber. She tests the rock now against the wall. She needs to give it to us. And she gets cucumber again. So this is basically the Wall Street protest that you see here.
So, yeah, you can see, I mean, that's what happens when we see someone else getting a better benefit than us, and so receiving something that we don't get. So, because this stuff has been hardwired in our brains for thousands of years. And you heard there that they've done the same experiments with dogs, with cats, with other animals, and found the same thing. So what can we do about that? How can we address these issues, and what can we do in terms of improving decision-making, knowing that a lot of the time people are in that homer mode? So this is a famous example from the book Nudge. Richard Thaler won the Nobel Prize for Economics 2 years ago, who's one of the co-authors of that book. And this is from Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam. What they found in Amsterdam was there was a problem where people were, frankly, in the men's toilets, were weeing on the floor a lot, and it was costing them a lot of money to keep it clean. And they tried all sorts of things, like putting up posters saying, please don't, it costs us X many euros to keep these bathrooms clean every year. Please don't wee on the floor, those kind of things, trying to change the layout. None of it had any effect. And then some bright spark working at Schiphol Airport, an economist said, well, one thing I know about men is when they go to the bathroom that they're always in that system one mode. It's very instinctive, habitual behaviour. But they like to have something to aim at. So why don't we paint a little fly onto the enamel of each of the urinals? And it reduced cleaning costs by 80%. So this nudge, we call it a nudge because what it is, it's to change the way a choice is presented, the way a choice is framed. Had an 80% improvement in efficiency for that particular task. And then applying that to lots of other contexts in terms of the kind of work that I've done with colleagues. We worked with a factory in South America where we were trying to encourage people to wash their hands more frequently, because obviously working in a food processing plant, as this was, you have to keep your hands clean because otherwise you can contaminate the food, which has severe repercussions. We came up with an intervention which was a hand stamp. So as people went onto the floor of the factory floor, you got your hand stamped with a harmless food dye, which acted as a reminder for people to go and wash their hands. It was a fairly simple nudge, and that increased hand hygiene, so rates of hand washing by 63%. In a similar way, working with a call centre, the way that worked, it was a subscription-based product. So when people called up to cancel their subscription, what they would do is offer them money off the next subscription as an incentive to stay. We said, don't do that. Use a few of these behavioural techniques, and I'll explain a couple of examples in a moment. Use a few of these behavioural techniques to nudge people into staying rather than cancelling a subscription, and that saved them $2 million every year. And then similarly, we worked with a credit card company where they had a button, the Apply Now button on their website, which was actually, you had to scroll through about 3 pages of text to get to that Apply Now button. We just made it more salient by moving it up the page and making it more prominent, and that increased the click-through rates by 54%. So these kind of small nudges can have really big effects and make a significant difference in terms of behaviour. To give you an example of a bigger project we did specifically around financial decision making, consumer financial decision making, but the principles apply here as well. We worked with a UK savings organisation, and they were looking to reduce the amount of time that people were spending on the phone, that their customer service representatives were spending on the phone talking to customers, not because without diminishing customer service. Basically, they identified that a lot of the calls were taking much longer than they needed to, which is not a good experience for the customer. And it's also not a good experience for them, obviously, because there's an efficiency issue there. So we conducted a pilot study where we implemented a number of nudges within the scripting, the language that was being used by the customer service representatives, with the aim of trying to get customers to that resolution of their call much quicker. And the black dotted line there represents our pilot group, which is around 30 people. And the green line represents the rest of the call centre, which is about 270 people. And over the course of the pilot, as you can see there, we actually reduced the average handling time. Over the rest of the call centre, it was actually going up because of various operational issues. But within our group, it declined over the period. We had an 11% reduction. So how did we do that? Here's an example. So one of the things that the customer service representatives had to do was, or one of the objectives was to try and convert people into paperless, because firstly, it's a better experience, but secondly, obviously, there were also some operational benefits to that as well. This particular organisation, they would send out a lot of money by cheques to people, which is obviously hugely operationally intensive. It's also not very good for the environment, the amount of paper they're having to generate to send those out. And from a customer perspective, it's also not as secure as getting the money paid directly into your account. So they would talk to customers on the phone about, would you like to stop receiving this money by cheque? And there were two different ways this could be framed. There was an old way, and then there was a new way that we introduced that was much more effective. So to give you these examples, the first one is the system is showing that if you are lucky enough to receive a prize, it comes as a cheque. Did you know you can get these prizes paid direct into your account? If you like, you can change that so you don't miss out. The second one is the system is showing that if you are lucky enough to receive a prize, it comes as a cheque. Would you like to change that so it goes direct to your bank account? That way you can get your prize money faster and more securely, use less paper, and save a trip to the bank. Now, how many of you think the left-hand one is more appealing to that System 1 Homer process? You raise your hands. That's quite a fair few. How many of you think the right-hand one is more appealing to the kind of Homer System 1? Okay. Those of you who said left, why do you think it was more appealing to the System 1 brain? Don't miss out. Yeah. Saves you time. Yeah. So the don't miss out thing is a really important concept in behavioural science, which is called loss aversion. It's basically, you've all heard of FOMO, fear of missing out. It's a really instinctive driver of human behaviour. So we hate to feel like we're missing out on anything. So simply saying, so you don't miss out, notice we don't actually say what you're missing out on. Just say, so you don't miss out. Obviously, if they go and question that, the CSR can say to them, well, you're missing out on all these benefits. But simply saying you don't miss out, it's like a closing down sale at a shop. When it says closing down sale, you instinctively go, ooh, I better get in there fast. The other thing that we did on this one, on the left-hand side, so the right-hand one was the old script, the left-hand one was the new script, was, do you notice that the CSR says, if you like, I can change this? Whereas on the right-hand one, they say, would you like to change that? Do you see the difference? So in the right-hand one, it's basically saying, you need to make the decision. You need to require what we call cognitive effort to do that. You need to put some thinking into it. And the reason why Homer is the poster boy for System 1 is because Homer is lazy. We don't like to think unless we have to. Daniel Kahneman has a great phrase about this, is like thinking is to humans like swimming is to cats. We can do it, but we'd really rather not. So the easier you can make things, and this is Richard Thaler summarizes his work as being make it easy. The easier you can make things, both in terms of the actual action required and the thinking required for people, the more likely they are to change their behavior accordingly. And one of the things about this as well, I guess the key thing to mention is that changing behavior is very complicated. So when we talk about heuristics and biases, this is the thing called the Cognitive Bias Codex, where someone has gone through all the social psychological research, identified all the different biases that humans are subject to. And there's a lot, as you can see. But best estimates is about 200. That means it is complicated to understand what works in context. So frameworks are very useful. This is a framework that we use at CSG, which summarizes some of those into key principles, what we call cogs that you can apply. But also the other key thing to bear in mind is about testing. So testing everything, especially counterintuitive things. To give you an example, counterintuitive thing, in that particular example with the bank, we found it was much more effective to say to customers, take your time and slow down, which when you're trying to reduce the length of calls is completely counterintuitive. But saying that to customers meant they were more likely to consider their answers to the questions, particularly the security questions, and therefore get them right, which got them through the process quicker. Does that make sense? So testing counterintuitive things is really important. And as you saw in that example, we ran a pilot where we were able to verify the effectiveness of what we're doing and then roll it out for the rest of the call center. But often what you'll find when you test things is one thing doesn't work. So we might have a couple of things that work really well, as you can see there, one which maybe is a little bit better than usual, and then one which is actually worse. But that's a useful insight as well, because you know never to do that. So the collective, the overall improvement you can deliver by doing it is much greater. So just to summarise, I guess the key things that I'd want you to take out here today from what behavioural science has told us, the new science around this is that recognising that the drivers of financial habits are often these very subconscious system one behaviours. And when you're talking about systems and processes, I do a lot of work with tech companies, and they often think about the irrationality of human behaviours as being bugs. They're not bugs, they're just innate things that make us human. So if you're not designing for those, then you're going to be limited in the effectiveness of anything you're implementing. Second thing is that these system one drivers can be, through targeted nudges, can deliver long-term behaviour change at relatively low cost, as we've seen with the examples. And the third thing is just to say it's really critical to test scientifically in context to understand what works. That doesn't mean you have to go to the kind of randomised control trial level, which is the kind of gold standard, but it's very expensive and it takes a long time. You can run control pilots, as in the example that I've shown you, to ascertain what works most effectively. And the key thing is to test in context, because there are so many biases that influence our behaviour on a daily basis, unless what works in your context may not work, it may not be what works in a different context. So testing that context as accurately as possible is really critical. All make sense? Bit of a race through of kind of quite a lot of science in there, I'm aware of that. But if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them later. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.